Hello and welcome back to our course on PowerPoint 2013. In this section we're going to look at laying out slides, and in particular I want to look at some of the options for alignment of objects on a slide. Now I'm going to illustrate this with three objects. I've taken our two circles that we've used before and added a green card with a cut-off corner, as you can see. But what we're going to look at can really be applied to just about any objects on slides in PowerPoint 2013. So first of all, let's select green card and then go to the Format tab in Drawing Tools and just quickly look at one or two of the things we've seen before. In the Arrange group there are a number of functions. We know that if we have these objects overlapping we can do bring forward, bring backwards. We looked at that before. We've also seen that we can rotate and flip objects, and in the case of green card, if I rotate it 90 degrees I get that, left 90 degrees I get that, flip vertical, flip horizontal. With the circles, of course, the flipping is different in that physically there's no difference, but of course the text will still flip or rotate. Another very important and useful tool when you're laying out slides is the selection pane, which we also saw before. If I click on selection pane again, it gives me a list of the objects that are on the slide, and on the right hand end of the entry for each of these objects there's a little picture of an eye. You can hide individual objects quite easily. This sometimes helps to keep big obstructive objects out of the way, or perhaps just objects that are getting in the way of what you're doing and visually interfering with laying out the slide. All you need to do is to click on the eye and an object becomes invisible, it's hidden. And of course you can do that with as many objects as you like. So if you've got some objects hidden and you want to show them all again, there's a show all button. Obviously there's also a hide all button as well. So when we're working with a number of objects on a slide, we can show and hide them. You know how to resize them, you know how to recolor them, change the text, add effects. You know how to bring them forward, send them back if they're in a group. You know how to group and ungroup them, and you know how to merge the objects into one. So what we're going to concentrate on now in this section is how to align the objects when they're normally going to stay as separate objects, but they need to be aligned. Now there are some good tools in PowerPoint 2013 for helping you to align objects, and one or two of those are new in PowerPoint 2013 as well. Let's start with one of the traditional ones though. If I go to the View tab, you may recall that we can switch on the ruler by checking the box there, and just below the checkbox for the ruler is a checkbox for grid lines. Now you should just about be able to make out the grid lines on the screen there. The slide has some faint dotted lines on it, and I can use those faint dotted lines to visually align objects. So let's suppose I wanted to align the tops of these three objects. I could move them, just drag them around and visually align them with one of the horizontal lines. Similarly, if I wanted to align their left edges, I could align them with one of the vertical grid lines. However, there is an even better way of doing that, and that is you can tell PowerPoint 2013 to snap objects to grid lines. Now in the Show group on the View tab, in the bottom right hand corner there is a dialog box launcher, and that launches the Grid and Guides dialog box. Note that as with all the other dialog boxes it's got a little question mark there if you need to go into Help. But the very first item on that is Snap to checkbox, Snap Objects to Grid. And if that is switched on, what will happen is as you move the objects around they will tend to snap to grid lines. Now the spacing of the grid lines is controlled by this second set of values here. The grid line spacing at the moment is 1/12 of an inch. That's not actually the distance between the lines. You can see the distance between the lines is actually 1 inch, so the grid lines are much more fine than that. But in order to demonstrate this, what I want to do is to increase the spacing to a much bigger value. It'll be easier for you to see if I do. I'm going to increase it actually to 1 inch, and then I'm going to switch on Snap Objects to Grid. There's a lower section here, Guide Settings. I'll come back to Guide Settings in a little while. So let's click on OK. Now we have a 1 inch grid. I'm going to try to move the red circle to the left. and in theory it will try to snap to one of the lines, which is basically going to be one of these lines of dots. It's usually easier to detect this if you're actually dragging it yourself, but see if you can see how this works. Click to select it, pull it. As soon as I pull it a bit, it leaps right over to the next line. I can't stop it in between really. So it's going in big chunks of one whole line as it goes. Now note, it can be lining the left or the right or the top or the bottom. So you may say, well, that's not on a grid line, but the left hand edge is. So it's trying to snap any part of its perimeter to a grid line. And that's basically how snap to grid works. Now using that approach and say moving this one up and down, you could get the top aligned, you could push the blue up and aligned, you could push the green up and aligned, you could get them all aligned to the same grid line. And that's traditionally one of the main ways that people have aligned objects on a slide. So now let's take a look at guides, because the third checkbox in the show group there is for guides. And if I switch the guides on, I get vertical and horizontal lines that can be used as alignment guides. So let's suppose I was going to do some sort of vertical alignment. I can grab the horizontal line, I can pull it up to a particular position, say that one, and then I can use it as a way of visually aligning each of the objects as I move it vertically. Now one of the key things here is that you can put the guide anywhere. You don't actually have to have snap to grid on as well. So if I went back into the dialog, removed snap objects to grid, but left on display drawing guides on screen, click on OK. Now watch what happens as I move up and down. I can get to that and I can align with that completely visibly, even though I've got a free move of the object within the space. I can align it vertically like that. So that's the function that the guides perform. Of course, as you can see here, you've got a vertical line here which acts as a guide for horizontal alignment. If you're not using it, you just ignore it. It doesn't actually do anything. It's only there really as a visual guide, as the name implies. Now I should point out there are a couple of things that you don't need for all this to work. One of them is you certainly don't need the ruler on for this to work, so let's switch off the ruler. And you don't actually need to be able to see the grid lines if you've got, say, snap to grid there. Also, to a large extent, the features we've looked at so far are at least in part superseded by the latest developments in alignment. I'm going to switch off guides altogether, so there's no vertical or horizontal guide. But what I want to do now is to move these three objects around without any visible alignment and just see what happens. In fact, before I do that, let me just go into the dialog, check that snap objects to grid is off, and check that the bottom item there, display smart guides when shapes are aligned, is on. Now watch what happens. I want to try to get these aligned so that the centers of the three objects are aligned with a sort of imaginary vertical line. So I'm going to move the red one down a little bit to make a bit more space. I'm going to put the blue above it. Now watch very carefully as I move the blue circle, because I get to a point where there is a line going through the blue circle and the red circle, and that indicates that their centers are aligned. And if I move the green card down here, watch for that same equivalent line. It's in the middle. Now I can be sure that those three objects are aligned, and the control that's making that happen is basically the smart guide. Now if I switch that off, let me move them around a bit more. Can't see anything. Can't see what's going on. Can't see whether they're aligned or not. Put it back on again, and there I can see. If I wanted to align the left edges, watch what happens. Green to red, they're aligned. Notice that that vertical line only touches green and red, because blue isn't aligned on the same line yet. Let me move blue a little bit to the right. Now all three are aligned along that edge. So in terms of sheer convenience, this is a really good way of aligning objects on a slide. And as I mentioned earlier, you're not just talking about shapes like this. This will align many different things, as I'll show you in just a moment. Let me move the green card first over to the left here. And what I want to do is to get the blue circle over to the right in such a position that the spacing measured horizontally between the green card and the red circle and between the red circle and the blue circle is the same. Now, apart from checking the alignment as we go, PowerPoint 2013 can also check spacing, and it will flag when the spacing between objects is equal. Now again, this is a bit tricky for you to see. I want you to watch this carefully as I move the blue circle around. So select blue circle. Notice that already I've got some alignments there. Vertical line indicates that the left edge of red circle and the left edge of blue circle are aligned. And it also indicates that the top of green card and the bottom of blue circle are aligned. So all the time I'm doing it, alignments are being flagged by PowerPoint. Now watch what happens. I'm going to move blue circle down here and I'm going to move it out towards the right. And I get to a point where that happens. And I've got a pair of markers there that indicate that the horizontal spacing between green card and red circle and the spacing between red circle and blue circle are equal. So it's told me that the objects are equally spaced. So I'm going to release the mouse. And I know that those objects are equally spaced on the slide. And it'll do the same in terms of spacing vertically, of course. So if I put those like that and then put green down here, again they are spaced equally vertically as well. So you can see what a powerful set of alignment tools you get in PowerPoint 2013. Now I've got a couple of other things to point out in relation to aligning objects. First of all, if I have an object selected, I've currently got big blue circle selected and I'm using the keyboard, then the arrow keys on the keyboard effectively nudge the object a little bit. So watch this carefully. If I click the up arrow key repeatedly, you'll see me just moving the object very slowly up the screen, and I can do that in very small increments. Similarly, now the left arrow. So that's a good way of nudging things very slightly if maybe you're not so good at fine adjustments using the mouse. And for those of you who are using touchscreen devices, everything that you've seen in this section still applies to touchscreen devices. If I move green card round with my finger, say, so I've selected it with my finger, now I'm moving it round, note that I still get all the same markers and I can still achieve all the same types of alignment just by using a touchscreen as well. Now, one of the things I mentioned just now is that this alignment works on just about any object in a PowerPoint presentation. So let's go back to the Houses of Parliament presentation that I've been working on throughout the course so far. I added one button to the demonstration version of this presentation, this House of Commons button, earlier on in the course. Let me now select that button and watch what happens if I move it up and down. I get that same alignment guide there, the smart guide, that says that button is now aligned with the top of that image. If I move the button down, I'll get a guide when it's aligned with the middle and down to the bottom and so on. Also note that I appear to get a line on the right, and you may say, well, what's that line on the right doing? Well, the line on the right is because of this particular placeholder. So the alignment was with the edge of that placeholder. So even where you can't see edges, so for instance the border of a placeholder, you'll get alignment there anyway because the rest of this particular title placeholder is still an object on the slide. And that brings us to the next little exercise. There may be very little for you to do on this, we'll see, but I produced example 11, which was my most recent version of the presentation on the Houses of Parliament in the UK, the one that included the interactivity and hyperlinks. I'd like you to take your equivalent of that, or indeed take example 11, and just go through it and make sure that where there is any alignment to be performed, that it's all aligned. So things are aligned with other things. Where edges look as though they should be aligned, they are. Bear in mind, that doesn't mean to say that everything needs to align with everything else. That's impossible. It's just situations where you believe that things should be equally spaced, left aligned, bottom aligned, right aligned, that they actually are. My answer to that is example 12. I'd like you to work on your own equivalent presentation, and I'll see you in the next section.